Obrigado to Lehman, Inspirare, and Peninsula for having me. Really excited to be here. My name is Jason Lang. I'm the CEO and co-founder for BloomBoard. We're a platform dedicated to empowering educator growth. What we know is that students come from all different places, all different contexts, but fundamentally at the end of the day, we know that teachers are the fundamental driver that can impact change in the classroom. So thinking about how do we really support and manage teachers is absolutely fundamental and foundational in how we think about inspiring change. When you think about all the demands on students and on teachers today, teachers are what matter most. And yet when you think about the life of a teacher today, how many people are teachers in the classroom? Raise your hand. So a small fraction. So thank you all. When you think about the life of a teacher today, it's really painful. And this is in the context of the US, in the context of Brazil, in the context of every country you go to. It's surprising how similar teachers' lives are. But when you think about it, the explosion of digital content, the explosion of demand for resources, for time, for distractions, and when you think about the demands on students and the context in which they come from, a teacher's life is really, really hard right now. And so how do we think about managing that process, and how do you think about changing the educational system where nearly half of the teachers in the system leave within 5 years? And again, this is data from the US, but I think it's probably data that applies to most other countries where there's just a massive amount of turnover. And so trying to think about how you manage the process and how do you think about the ways that you inspire teachers when we know that the biggest driver for why teachers leave the system is that they simply just don't feel supported. They don't feel professional. They don't feel like they have the resources and the ways to empower them to really drive growth and to really engage their students given all of the demands on their time. So now imagine a world in which you could really empower and support teachers to be the best they can absolutely be. What would that world look like? Think about the thought experiment in your own mind. What do you think that world would look like? And how do you think about it in the context of what innovation is today? What we know is for innovation to really happen, and I'll take a little bit of a step back here, I think it's a bit of a trap to think about innovation in the context of just technology. Schools are not just technology machines, and ed tech companies have, for the last 5 or 10 years, just been throwing technology at schools, but a lot of the innovation that happens in schools is completely non-technical. It's about what policies do you have in place. And in fact, some of the innovation that happens in schools is actually what you stop doing right now. And schools have all sorts of very interesting ways to think about how they manage their processes, and some are actually counterproductive to really outcomes and growth for kids. And so thinking about innovation in a much broader context is really important to understanding what that looks like, knowing that that innovation has to help us propel teacher growth and has to help us really inspire and focus on the outcomes for kids. And so how do you take, as I was trying to put this presentation together, the question is how do you take an idea as big as innovation across all of the technology plus the policy plus the non-technology, the anti-innovation, stopping the anti-innovation, how do you take all of that and put it into a single frame, a single lens that makes it easy to understand what are the options, what's the potential to really think about driving change in the education system? And so the easiest lens I can think about it is through fundamental motivation. At the end of the day, schools are large machines around adults that are inspiring kids. And so what you have to be able to look at is what are the motivations of the teachers, what are the motivations of the students, and there's a book that Daniel Pink wrote, how many people have actually read this book? Or have experience with this? So again, a small fraction. All of you should go buy this book today. It's an amazing book, and the whole idea is that it's about how do you think about what drives people and what drives the actual systems and the actions people take. And it turns out that it's much more about psychology, and it's much more about the incentives that are in place than it is about the technology you put in front of people. And so what Daniel Pink and what the research behind this really comes down to is that fundamentally at the end of the day, what makes people do what they do, for better or worse, is about autonomy. Do people feel like they can own the work that they're doing? Do people feel like they have an understanding of how they actually manage that process? Do people feel like they're on a path to mastery? And what does mastery actually look like? I think a lot of the conversations we've been having in education for the past several decades is much more of the right? Give students grades. If you get a C, you still pass. Did you demonstrate mastery? Should you actually pass if you just got a C? And if you got a grade? It doesn't make sense that we don't focus on the ideas for mastery. In the same way for teachers, we don't focus on mastery in terms of how we think about competencies. And so changing the conversation is really fundamental to understand what does mastery look like? And how do you inspire mastery for people to really focus on the conversations that they're having? And then finally, and this is probably potentially the easiest in education, how do you think about purpose? And everything that people do, every way, the number one question that comes up from students is, why am I learning this? Why is this useful to me? What is the purpose behind this? And why do I need to have this to really contribute or to do whatever I'm trying to do in my life? So trying to understand how you inspire purpose behind the actions that we take, these psychological drivers are absolutely the fundamentals that drive how people inspire action. And so using this, I wanted to go through a couple of examples that we have in our work in the US and that we see across the country and we see across the world about really interesting ways that people are driving these three foundational levers to really impact change and what the potential is for teachers and for helping students grow. First, on the autonomy. So you can't quite see this slide all that well. So it's a little girl tying their shoes. So I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old at home. And my son has taken up a new phrase which is a very interesting phrase, which is do it myself. And he constantly will say everything that you want him to do, it's do it myself. Because fundamentally innate in human beings, we want to be able to own the process. We want to be able to have autonomy over what we're doing. We want to be able to do it ourselves. And so when you force things on people, and when we force curriculum, when we force structured processes, it undermines the process to really think about how we manage growth and how we manage learning for both adults and for students. And so one of the things that we find that's really around driving this is a concept. So this is the translation doesn't help here, which is called SMART goals in the US. And SMART goals is really a specific set of goal planning exercises. So how many people in the room, no matter what organization you come from, how many people in the room have actually written down a goal for the next 6 months or so? All right, so we're pretty good there. So the research says that if you actually just the act of writing down a goal, that's all you have to do, write down a goal, that act will increase your likelihood of actually achieving that goal by over 50%. In some places, it's actually 75% above. So it's a very simple act, and yet when we think about how students learn and when we think about how teachers learn, often this process is missing in schools. And there isn't a way to think about how do you create mechanisms for teachers to plan around their goals, to think about what those goals are, and then really set timelines and set processes to achieve those goals. The second is really around personalized learning communities. And so in the US, this has a slightly different and somewhat of a negative context, given that it's been a little bit abused. But the idea of small groups learning in really foundational ways has a ton of potential. And there's a lot of research that shows if you can structure a personal learning community that typically is 3 to 5 people around a very specific topic and a specific outcome, maybe a goal, I would suggest, and then use it to think about how you actually facilitate that conversation. And the case here is the facilitator is actually one of the biggest drivers of outcomes. So if you want to achieve that goal and you want to be in a personal learning community, someone has to take the agency and the ownership to be the expert and to drive that conversation. And so we see a lot of these small groups, and Pearson has actually done a lot of research that's been really impressive, showing that if you create these small communities and you structure them in very time-bound increments, so over 6 weeks, focused on a goal and led by an expert facilitator, that creates really meaningful impacts in terms of how teachers engage their students and the actual impact on their student growth and on their student outcomes. So thinking about that sort of innovation, again, this is totally non-technical. You don't have to have anything in your schools today. You don't have to have internet in your schools today to structure this process, because both of these are simply things you can do with exactly the tools you have to help really empower your teachers to own their own development and really drive growth in each other and in their peers. The second topic here is really around mastery. So I love Star Wars. So Obi-Wan is clearly the best exemplar of mastery you can find. And so when we think about mastery, the question is there's this whole shift nowadays around competency-based approaches to learning. And I think there's been a lot of conversations about taking that approach for students, but why wouldn't we apply that same approach for teachers? And in fact, it may actually be much easier to apply that approach to students once you help teachers understand that that's the best way for their own learning to take place. And so what we've seen is there are a couple of new innovations around mastery that are really exciting, and these actually do have some sort of technology that can help enable them. One is around mentorship models. So there's lots of research that shows the more you have, whether it's pre-service teachers, the more you have mentorship and apprenticeship, and the more teachers can learn from experts before they get into their classrooms or as part of their student learning, that helps their progress and helps them get up that curve for the first couple of years, and in the end, keeps them in the profession a much longer time, but also helps the outcomes and helps them inspire growth in their students because they're able to watch what another teacher looks like. Teachers live on islands that they do not get to talk with each other because of the way days are structured. So the more you think about how do you structure mentorship into classrooms, it's a really important key to driving educator growth because teachers want to be able to see what other educators are doing. They want to see what mastery looks like, and they don't have a lot of examples to do so. There's also some very interesting work we've started doing and some other work that from other companies in the US, which are virtual communities for teachers. And so trying to think about in the same way people are learning how to learn English online, learning other ways to kind of think about online learning, there are now systems where teachers can plug in, access master teachers, ask them quick chats via text, ask them via video hangouts, and ask them about the challenges that they're struggling with. And that sort of way to get on-demand support from master teachers is really interesting in terms of how you think about scaling innovation and how you think about scaling best practice for those teachers. The second model is really around video-based feedback. So anyone who's been through a teacher prep program, certainly in the US, I would guess this is probably the case in other countries, video is by far the best way to learn any sort of performance-based profession. And part of what makes teaching so hard is that trying to think about the balance between art and science in a performance context is really difficult. If you think about the number of, if you told athletes right now who had to do really specific tasks over and over and move their work on demand based on the needs around them, if you told athletes that they could not train without video right now, there would be an absolute massive revolt. And video in athletics or in any other performance-based profession is used absolutely ubiquitously. Video in teaching is not. And so trying to think about how you get teachers more comfortable with video, we did a research project with Harvard over the past year, and all of the data that came out of the research was not only does video help improve collaboration amongst teachers, but what it does is actually spreads out the distribution of the ways teachers engage in each other around feedback and around content. So the expertise that you have in schools, those individual teachers actually become, they are gone to less than the rest of the teachers in the school because all of a sudden teachers feel like they're more comfortable watching video. They're more comfortable seeing what each other's practice look like, and therefore they collaborate more, and therefore all of their collective feedback around what their success in their survey and their happiness all goes up. And I think we'll have data next year that actually shows, and their student data improves as well. So thinking about this idea of how do you use video as a mechanism to really help understanding what great practice looks like, and then how do you get teachers comfortable with the fact that if you've ever watched yourself on film, it's kind of brutal. And I probably won't watch this video ever because it's just kind of awkward. But it's really powerful to understand how you're doing and what your practice looks like. And in education, it's even more critical that we provide that sort of support because video has a really big impact in those sort of outcomes. And finally, one of the things that I'm probably most excited about is really this idea around micro-credentials. So if we think about teaching no longer as a profession of what are you trying to teach your kids, but what are the skills that your students need? And Mario mentioned a little of this. What are the skills your students need? And therefore, what skills do you need to convey those skills? How do you facilitate that sort of skills? And we are doing a bunch of really interesting work right now in the US, trying to move states and move districts and move schools from a seat time model where teachers are given credentials or given credits based on the number of hours they spend in a classroom sitting in a seat. How do you move people from that context to what does it mean to demonstrate mastery for a specific skill? How are your questioning strategies? How does that compare to what a really master teacher thinks about when you get into questioning? What does classroom management look like in an expert classroom versus in your classroom? And so starting to think about how you move the profession from a place where you can credential teachers based on seats, based on the time they spend in seats, to moving them towards a place where what if you could have a set of teachers really think about the way that their craft is evolving and responding to that. Right now, most of the models, and this is certainly the case in the US, most of the models for education don't account for anything associated with social and emotional learning. So all of the skills around grit and perseverance and creativity, all of the skills that we're trying desperately to incorporate in our schools, our old models around teaching and pedagogical instruction don't account for them. And so what would it look like if you had a system in which the mastery component of what does empowering resilience in your students look like, if teachers could leverage that and run with each other, and demonstrate mastery with each other and be able to get a credential for that, and they could get those same 6 hours that they would otherwise have to get if they sat in a university classroom, what would that sort of system look like? And how would it change the way teachers think about their own context in their craft, in their profession? And so a lot of the work we've been spending is trying to think about both the political drivers and also the actual technology drivers to create that sort of environment, because clearly micro-credentials is a better approach. And I do fundamentally think that if we want to inspire competency-based learning in our students, and if all the work that's being done around badges and student learning, if all of that work is to actually come to fruition, we have to start with teachers. It will not work to simply throw competency-based learning at kids when teachers don't know how to do it, because the shift is massive. And it's very hard to understand, how do I incorporate technology? How do I incorporate competencies in my classroom when I don't know what that looks like myself? I've never seen that. I've never sat in a classroom that had competency as the core approach. So really thinking about how we shift that model is really, really important. And I think there's lots of small things that you can do to change that sort of process for policy itself. And then finally, and again, this is a little bit of this is the easy one, but probably my favorite one, which is how do you inspire purpose? Teachers are teachers for a reason. They are taking a job that is brutal. They are taking less pay to do it, and they are going through it because they love their kids and because they want to inspire growth. And they want to help kids. And the moment you find a teacher who gets that aha moment with a kid, that is the happiest day a teacher has until the next moment that happens. And every teacher knows that feeling and knows what that's like. And so it's about, how do we create more of those moments? How do you think about driving opportunities for those aha moments where kids can feel these same set of psychological drivers for themselves? And in this case, this is actually more about removing the impediments from this. Teachers do this naturally. They do this instinctually because they're great teachers and because that's what they want to do. And yet what we find is, certainly in the US, is education looks more like a compliance system than any other system. In many ways, it's not an outcome system, because people spend a lot of time, if you just ask a principal, ask a leader, ask a systems leader, how much of the time do you spend reporting data? How much of the time do you spend on things that are compliance related that don't really impact your kids? And could you take all of those barriers away and really start to focus on instruction? What would that look like? What if you trusted teachers to do their craft? And you still need to have some sort of accountability. You still need to have some sort of verification. But what if you could really trust educators to really drive instruction and drive outcomes for their kids and remove those barriers for compliance? And that sort of shift it's a very hard shift, because undoing any sort of compliance is often harder than putting it in place, which is part of the reason we have very big bureaucracies around this. But trying to think about driving that sort of outcome is really key and really important. And then finally, how do you make sure that everything you do, no matter what it is, it can be anything, it can be technology, it can be a professional development session, whatever it is, should focus on kids and focus on the outcomes. And if the constant lens, a lot of this gets into how we think about how we train principals and how we think about head teachers, they are a critical linchpin in this entire process. In that instructional leaders, where you find really good instructional leaders, one of my favorite quotes, I've got a couple of seconds left, one of my favorite quotes came up from some user research we were doing, where an old curmudgeon-y superintendent, principal, head teacher said to me, look, education is the same everywhere you go. It's basically a principal fighting for, there's a top 10% of their teachers, fighting with the bottom 10% of their teachers, and they're fighting over the middle 80%. And your job as an instructional leader is to help support the top 10% while not getting sued by the bottom 10%. And that is your job as an instructional leader. And so we have to recognize how instructional leaders think about focusing on outcomes for kids, because where you create that culture and where you create the place where those teachers can win and where you can inspire growth with those top master teachers, right? The bad teachers don't want to work in that environment, and you win over that middle 60%, and that's where real magic happens in classrooms. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.